I can see all the characters in my head. I am all the characters. I can hear their voices. I see where they live. I have to try and tell a story in one little statement a day. With luck, I can make a statement that has some meaning to it, or funny, or whatever.
Before she reshaped Canadian comics, Lynn Johnston was just drawing her life as she lived it, never imagining it would touch hundreds of millions of lives. Today we hear from Lynn Johnston, the creator of For Better or For Worse. I'm Hannah Octavia, and this is Seasoned Professional. Hello everyone, welcome back to Seasoned Professional. My name is Hannah Octavia, and I am here with the lovely Lynn Johnston today. Welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you. Pleasure.
I am very excited for today's conversation. Perhaps you could give my listeners just a little bit of an overview of who you are, the great comic of Canada. Tell us your little elevator pitch.
I guess like all kids who are class clowns, I had to be curbed and told to, settle down. And I was always trying to make people laugh, and it didn't really do well for me. A lot of people avoided me because I was trouble, but I was funny. I got along with the teachers quite well because I was okay, but I was disruptive, right? And I really have to be grateful to my teachers who roped in that behavior and put it to work. And so I ended up doing posters for the schools and working for the talent shows. And, anytime we had a play at the school, I'd be always involved and things like that. And I've done talks in schools, and I can point out in a classroom who is me, and I will point them out and I'll say, I know exactly who you are, because they can't sit still and they're always trying to make jokes and, cause trouble. So that was me. So I think, in a way that was good, because later on it gave me a certain aggressive edge when it came to finding a job. I mean, I was obsessed with animation as a kid. I loved the cartoons. I would hide in the theater so I could watch the cartoons a second time around. The plan was to, be able to work for Disney or something like that. And when I was in my early 20s, I was able to get a job at Canada West Films, which was a Vancouver television station that was just starting to do animated commercials. And I was in second year art school at the time. And so I waddled in there and got this job. It was a horrible job, but you learned a lot. You got $1 an hour. It was a 24-hour shift. You start at 7 o'clock at night and work till 7 o'clock in the morning kind of thing. And it was abusive and awful, but the people that I worked shoulder to shoulder with were great. And one of the girls' parents were writers for Disney. So off we went down to California to see if we could get a job down there. And we were both married to very opinionated radio TV guys who couldn't get a job in California because there's a lot of opinionated radio TV guys down there. So, but she and I were offered a job at J. Ward Studios, which is Super Chicken and Georgia the Jungle, and who wouldn't say yes? Of course, the guys wouldn't let us take the jobs because they couldn't get work. So in tears, we came back to Canada. I was taking a tour around Hamilton, Ontario, looking for work. And that same day, there was an ad in the paper for an artist for the hospital. So I went home and I drew as many guts drawings as I could and went to this interview and got the job as a medical school. So because I could draw well, they put me through first year medical school with a couple of other artists. And we learned on the job. We went to autopsies and surgical procedures and saw all kinds of immense, surgical techniques, because a lot of this stuff is very difficult to photograph. And so you end up doing illustrations of how these procedures work. So you learn a tremendous amount, but a lot of it is dry, like epidemiology and biostatistics. So I would illustrate them with cartoons and ended up doing a lot of cartoon work for the medical school. One of the doctors challenged me to do some cartoons about pregnancy. And by the time my baby was born, I had 80 drawings, and my husband had left for someone else. And I was sort of stewing in my own misery at the time when my obstetrician phoned me at home and said, what are you doing tonight? Come over for dinner and bring the baby. And I thought, holy smokes, how often does your doctor invite you over for dinner? So I went over to his house, and his wife opened the door, and there he was sitting in the living room with all of my cartoons that I had drawn while I was, coming in for examinations. And he had a bottle of champagne. He was sitting on the floor with all these drawings around him, and he said, "Kid, you got a book." And he helped me get my first little book published, which was called David, We're Pregnant. And it was kind of an irreverent look at pregnancy and stuff. It was just saying what it was really like to get pregnant and go through the whole process, because for me it was shocking. Your body is taken over by someone else. You're an apartment building for another tenant, and so holy smokes, what an experience that is, right? So I chronicled that in this book, and it sold really well. So I did 3 books. Those 3 books were sent by a publisher in Minneapolis to Universal Press Syndicate with a letter saying she should be syndicated, and they sent me a 20-year contract. And that's how it began. Yeah.
Wow. Where do we begin? Where do we begin? I think we'll start at the very beginning. Your father was a jeweler. Your mother was an excellent artist, calligrapher, and your father was also very humorous and kind of funny in many ways. And you said that you were a bit of the class clown, Do you think that those tendencies came from your parents, or do you think it was completely your own thing?
It was showbiz. My dad should have been in vaudeville. He was born a few years too late, but he was showbiz. He had all the action, the facial expressions, the hand gestures. He could dance, he could sing, he could pratfall. He used to bring home the Keystone Cops movies and run them forwards and backwards through the projector so that we could see how the gags were done. And he would say, everyone is set up and timed. And he said, these people risked their lives to do this comedy, but look at how precise it is. There was always music, always joking in the house. And of course, we didn't get a TV till I was about 10. So you're playing board games with your parents and you're spending a lot of time. We didn't have all these other things to take your mind away. So there was a lot of communication and banter, and both of my parents loved wordplay and poetry. And anytime we could come up with a one-liner, if it was a good one, it didn't matter. If it was insulting, it was, yes, got that one. And I remember one time my dad saying, I bet you lie awake at night thinking of nasty things to say. And I thought, oh, the time I've been wasting sleeping. I could be lying awake thinking nasty things to say. But it was a talented family, but busy. I mean, you grow up in the 50s and 60s. There's no microwave, no dryer. Your clothes are drying outside. A lot of the moms stayed home and were very unhappy because many of them were desperate for an education and wanted to work outside the home. My mom, for example, was a very bright woman who wanted to be a surgeon, but her dad was British and didn't believe in educating women. So she ended up being his private secretary, and he was a stamp dealer. He was a forgery expert in stamps, which, can you imagine? Snore. And he wouldn't let her socialize with other people, men, and she had no friends. So when the war started, she joined the war and really became herself. And my parents met in England, but my dad had an accent that my grandparents didn't approve of. He was not from the right part of England, you see. And so they didn't think my mother should marry this man. He had no, status. And so they were very cruel to my dad, and took a long time before they accepted him. So there was a lot of tension in the family, but Dad he overcame pretty well everything with humor and theater and music. And he was a positive role. He was a positive guy. I don't ever remember him being unable to handle something without seeing the positive side of it. And so, I had this really strange two sides to this British family. One was kind of upper crust and baby finger up and drinking tea just right. And the other was, wah, 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 the old hit the bar and sing the songs and hang out with the boys after dinner, And yeah, so it wasn't until my mother was in her 60s that she actually lost all of this stuff and had fun. And she could laugh out loud. She never laughed out loud when we were kids because she wasn't supposed to. It wasn't ladylike,
Was that something that you were aware of growing up? Like, did you know that she had other dreams outside of the home and outside of raising you?
Not really. As kids, you just want, I want to be fed. I want to be clothed. I want to go somewhere. I want to be entertained. I want to be, I want. And you're, just so busy accepting the generosity of your parents that you don't think about their life at all. I remember going to a summer cottage thinking, what fun. But my mother never left the cottage. By the time she finished cleaning up after breakfast, she was preparing lunch. And then there's bathing suits and sand and wet towels and stuff. And then she's preparing dinner, and then she's getting you to bed, and then she's making the beds in the morning. She never had a holiday, but we never thought about that. It was, where's
Mhm.
lunch? Why isn't dinner ready? I think there were a lot of very unhappy moms. And
Mhm.
so, yeah, but you tend to forget that all of those mothers had had intelligence and yeah, aspirations beyond doing the laundry, but life was so dependent on somebody at home doing all the
Mhm.
chores. So it was a
Yeah.
different time. At finally in my old age, I am realizing how difficult my mother's life was and why she was as unhappy as she was.
Mhm. Mhm. And has that just been through reflecting on your childhood that you're realizing these
Yeah.
things? Yeah.
Was angry with my mother for years. Oh, well, this happened when I was 12 and that happened when I was 19 and then that, these petty, stupid things. And when you get older and you only have so many more years left, you have to reflect on past and what you've learned. I think of this as being a university. If you don't go through this life without learning something and being a better person at the end of it, you really
Mm.
haven't learned it at all. And you're destined to come back as a toad or something. I have much more empathy for her now than I did then, and I'm sorry because I wish we could meet again as two older adults and just talk it out.
I relate to what you're saying so much because when it's like a mother-daughter relationship, it feels very messy at times. Like you said, when you're a child, it's want, 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 want. And that's so true. Like there are so many moments in my life where, at the age of 20, I finally start to know who my parents are. And with that, I start to understand them a little bit more. But the true understanding of what they went through, I don't think will ever hit me until I have children of my own. I suppose I'm curious, when you had your children, is that when things started to click into place that, holy shit, like my mother worked so hard?
When I had kids of my own, I wanted to raise them my own way. And the realization that you have a lifetime commitment doesn't happen really until the kids are in their 20s. And yeah, I didn't start becoming really sympathetic and empathetic towards my parents until just recently, which is it's a real admission. And I'm sorry to say that because but as long as it happens sometime, as long as you're aware sometime. And, I'm very sorry that they're both gone and I can't reconcile anything with them, but that
Hmm.
happens.
When your parents did pass away, what was your relationship with them like?
Um, it was a relief when they passed. It was a relief when my mother passed because I felt as though I could never do anything right. That when she was in the hospital, I brought my 10th anniversary book, I was so proud of it. And she was lying in the hospital bed and I showed it to her and I said, Mom, this is my 10th anniversary book and I dedicated to you and Dad. And I showed them the first page with what I had written. And she just rolled her head on the pillow and turned away. And, it was really painful because she would tell other people that she was proud of me, but she would never say that to me. And my dad was her puppet almost, like, she was quite brutal and quite ruled the roost, and he would go along with whatever she wanted. And if she decided she wasn't speaking to me, if I phoned their house, Dad would pick up the phone and say, "Your mother doesn't want me to talk to you." And you'd say, "Grow a pair, you bozo, talk to me." And so when they passed away, both of them, it was a relief. I didn't cry. I handled all of the affairs. It was a process that allowed me the freedom to carry on without that weight of never being able to do anything right.
Hmm.
And maybe that's why I was successful in what I did. Because
Hmm.
if you never do anything right, you're constantly striving for perfection.
Hmm.
So other people's opinion meant a lot over the years, and oh, it's funny how you look back and you say, "Oh, I was such a fool. I was such a kid." But we're all that way. I mean, who who does anything perfectly? And the fact that we don't do things perfectly probably makes life much more exciting. And certainly the strip was up and down. There were days when I thought, I can't do this. I mean, that's life, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Do you think you are still trying to please people now? Or do you think you're trying to please yourself in this today?
I'm more interested in doing what's right for my family, for my
Hmm.
daughter and my grandchildren. I don't care so much about other people's opinions because I have lifelong friends now.
My last question about your childhood is what was your relationship like with your brother?
My brother and I really cared for each other. We really did. We both of us had a great sense of humor. We both of us really well. We didn't have a lot of outside friends, right? And it rains a lot in Vancouver, and we had a big empty basement. So, yeah, we spent a lot of time playing together. He was 2 years younger. The problem for us was that he was the favorite in the family because it's a British family. British families like boys, and at least in those days, because it carries on the family name kind of thing. So my grandfather doted on my brother, which was awful. And because if we went to visit them, he would spend a lot of time with my brother and give him gifts and, take him places. And I was sort of left kind of wondering, well, what about me? And so my mother was also very much, like her dad, and my brother was the favorite. And so it didn't do our relationship any good at all. When one is favored over the other, both kids suffer. And so years later, we were able to talk about that. And, my brother was able to say how difficult it was for him. He didn't want to have that discrepancy. He and I got along just fine. So, and I still think the world of him. He's a wonderfully talented musician and composer and writer. And, I think the world of him.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's interesting that there was such like prominent favoritism in your household. Personally, I I relate to that, and it's a very
Mm,
strange thing to kind of deal with and reflect upon because, over my life, that has kind of been a little bit in my reality, like my brother is given more freedom in many ways. And I very feel like it's my responsibility to, make the family proud. So it's a tricky thing to talk about, especially, you being
it
the
is.
eldest daughter, me being the eldest daughter. It's weird.
It's a dynamic that eldest daughters can talk about, right? You share that reality with other folks, and you say, "Really, it happened to you too?" But there it is, right? So I had this real hate for my grandfather, but I used to have to stay with my grandparents for 1 week every summer, give my parents a break. So my brother would stay a week, and he would be favored. I would stay a week, and nothing would happen. I wouldn't go anywhere. And one time, my grandfather was fast asleep on the living room couch in their house, and he hated the oil on the top of the peanut butter. Like the old peanut butter would settle, right? And you'd have to mix it up before you'd put it on the bread. But there would be sort of an inch of oil at the top of the peanut butter. So there was a jar of peanut butter sitting in the kitchen with this inch of oil sitting on the top. And there's Gramps with his mouth open and he's snoring away. And my grandmother was gone somewhere. They had a big piece of property with a hillside and peach trees on the back there. Anyways, I worked a spoonful of this oil
Oh,
into it.
God.
Got a spoonful of this oil, and I carefully went into the living room and I poured it into my grandfather's open mouth. And then I head for the hills. I was way at the top of the peach trees before he was off the couch, and I could see him going, oh, and he was on the back porch screaming at me, oh, this mouthful of peanut butter oil. And my grandmother showed up, and I remember her saying, but darling, she's just a child. She's just a child. And I was thinking, yeah, I can get away with being just a child for a while, but eventually not.
Not
Yeah.
it. Oh my goodness.
It was funny, and I still remember it now as being one of my crowning efforts, for independence.
How old were you, do you think?
8,
8?
in around there.
That's I think that's pretty impressive for an 8-year-old. It's quite cunning. Kids are smart. They don't get enough credit, honestly. It's like my boyfriend and I are, we've been together for quite some time, and within the next few years, like, we hope to have children, and kind of having those conversations of like, oh my goodness, children are so much work. Like, it is 100% of your mental capacity. And I fear for my future self trying to juggle motherhood because I'm a type A, I'm the eldest daughter, I want to be the best that I can. So juggling that motherhood, but then also juggling like, oh, wife or partner, or I'm supposed to be this like lover that like I don't know how you do it. There's not enough room in my head.
Well, it sounds like you've done a lot of thinking about it, which is excellent because by the time you do decide, you will have really had some life skills and some experience. And so if you've had time to think about it and you're ready, you'll be a fine mom. You'll do a great job. And your kids
Well,
will respect you. I mean, they'll like you, but as long as that's not fair, as long as you're fair and
yeah,
you have a sense
yeah.
of humor and you're
Oh my
honest,
goodness.
a kid really likes an apology and then they learn to apologize as well.
But anyways, I digress and I will stop talking about myself. Um, you got married to your first husband, Doug, and you had this opportunity to go and pursue your dreams in California at the J. Ward Studios, and then he said no. So tell me how that felt. What was that like, being told you can't have your dream?
It's a different time where even though you were not subservient, you were trained to be subservient. The guy always drove the car, the guy always made the plans, the guy managed the money, and you rolled with it because that was where, your background was and their background. I mean, it's centuries of oppression almost, but the woman takes second place. And so we were not surprised. And even though my friend and I were both desperately unhappy, we knew that our place was with our husbands, right? And so we sat in
Mm-hmm.
the back of the car, cried all the way back to Vancouver, and the guys chatted and laughed and talked, and it was fine for them. But that was a different time. Today, what would I do today? I don't know. You don't want to break up a marriage. You invest so much of your heart and soul into other people, and to break it up over a job, I think I probably would have come home even then.
And
Well, sometimes you think someone else is writing the novel for you because it was the best thing that could have happened for me to be launched into this new life in Ontario. First of all, I'd never lived away from home in Vancouver. I'd never lived far away from my parents. It was a huge change in my life, and it made such a difference. I think everybody needs to move away from home. Like you're away from home right now. You're in England, and this huge difference of responsibility and this opportunity to just get out there and be you. So going to Ontario was great, and getting a job at the medical school was great because I've always been obsessed with medicine. I was never smart enough to get into medical school, but to be there as an artist was phenomenal because I learned whatever I wanted to learn. I went wherever I wanted to go. I was able to see amazing surgical procedures. I was able to draw some amazing things. I learned so much. The most wonderful experience was the autopsy that I watched. My
mm-hmm.
studio was about, I don't know, a couple of doors down from the autopsy room, and I could hear the saws and I could see the, conveyor going back and forth. And I asked one of the docs if I could watch, and they said, sure. So it was a woman who was in her 50s, and she died of syphilis, of all things. Like, people don't die of syphilis anymore. They were looking to see how it had affected her body and her brain.
Mm-hmm.
And when everything is all opened up, what you see is exactly what you see in the anatomy books. And I was standing there thinking, what makes us really go? All of this
Mm-hmm.
stuff is the machinery that makes this rubbery, gooey, liquid mess work. And it's got to be a spirit. It's got to be something out there that makes you who you are. So I came out of that with the most incredible sense of spiritual fulfillment. I mean, there is a God, there is something out there. And it was a great experience. So,
Yeah.
even in a room where they're doing an autopsy, there's a tremendous reverence for the body and the soul.
Mm-hmm. That's really beautiful and so interesting that you had that opportunity. It's amazing. And when you were doing this job, I believe you were in it for about 5 years from my recollection. And then at some point you became pregnant with your first child. Take me through that. Was it a planned pregnancy? Were you still with your husband at this point? What was that time like?
That's quite a story. That would make a novel. I had broken up with my husband. He was quite a womanizer. He was a drinker. He was abusive. He was not a good person. And he was out all night with someone, and I packed a bag and I ran off to Vancouver. I didn't tell anybody I was leaving. I was determined that I was gone forever, even though I was leaving my house and my job and my friends, and I was leaving everything, but it was self-preservation. And I arrived in Vancouver, and, my parents were not helpful, not welcoming. I was back in my little bedroom with my teddy bears and the comforter that I grew up with and the same curtains in thinking I had a house, I had a home, I had, a job, and my parents took off to visit to their cottage in Hope and to visit friends and left me alone at the house. And I went to visit an old art school chum, and we went for a trail ride up into the McGillivray Mountains. I was feeling uncomfortable, and he says to me, "I think you're expecting. I think that's why, you're not feeling good.
Hmm.
And stay with me. I will raise this baby with you." But, anyways, as it turned out, my ex had come into Vancouver to look for me. And I ran into him by accident. They say, it was serendipity. I ran into him in Vancouver, and we reconciled, and I came back to Ontario. So I did not stay with my friend on the mountaintop, although we're still friends. And the baby was born, and 6 months after the baby was born, my ex left. He'd been having an affair with this woman, and he moved in with her. And then I was a single mom for a while. So I put everything that he owned on the front lawn, his stereo, his clothes, his skis, everything. And I called the Salvation Army and I said, "Okay." They said, "Are you sure?" And I said, "You bet." So they took all his stuff, and there I was with the house and the kid and the car. And it was $47 a month, I think, was my mortgage. But if I spent more than $20 a week on groceries, I couldn't afford the mortgage. And it was really threadbare living, but it was some of the best years of my life because I learned how strong I was. I learned that I could be a good parent. I had wonderful friends in the community who were single moms, and we held each other tight. One girl, the two of us we realized that you get depressed at about 3 in the morning when you can't call anybody and your eyes are running and you look in the bathroom mirror and you say, "No wonder he left me. I look like shit." But then we agreed that we could call each other at any time. So she'd phone me or I'd phone her and say, "You feel like shit?" "Yeah, me too. But do you look good, babe? Do you look good?" Adrian and I went to the Salvation Army, bought the sexiest nightgowns we could find. And we would call each other, "Do you look good, babe? How's your hair? How's your face? Gone to bed alone and I'm good. And we buoyed each other up. We're still friends. I called her the other day. We're just still friends. So with the down of the divorce and single parenthood was the up of learning I could do it on my own and having wonderful friends. And I mean, that kind of bond is lifelong, right? I lived through that and I'm very proud of myself. I look back at it as being, yeah, that's one chapter of this story that I aced it.
Yeah, 100%. And, I'm sorry to hear, first of all, that your first husband was abusive. That must have been a really hard thing to deal with. And yeah, I respect it as a very sensitive topic. So thank you for sharing. And I suppose, around this time with your first husband that is now left, you're on your own with your child. The months prior to your first son being born, you were a patient of Dr. Murray Enkin, and he is a huge reason as to who you are today. So I suppose perhaps bring me through what he did for you. You gave us a little bit of a sneak peek at the beginning, but I suppose just how did he change the trajectory of your life?
Well, he gave me a challenge, which was just what happened when I was in elementary school and I was sort of out of control and all over the place. But teachers would give me a challenge. Could you do posters for this? Could you do the cover of a book for that? And so he challenged me to do some cartoons for the ceiling above his examining tables because, of course, you're lying there for half an hour waiting for the exam and there's nothing to look at. And so that challenge was all I needed to do all of these cartoons. And then the response was better than income almost, because if people laugh at what you do, then yeah, you can be a cartoonist. You can do funny illustrations. And the audience was his staff and his patients. And so I was very lucky to have somebody who was so kind and caring and well connected. And he helped me find a publisher, and we got that first little book out. And then I did 2 more books, but I retained a friendship with Murray Enkin for years and years.
And I suppose because, you said before your dream as a young adult was to get into animation. When Murray gave you this kind of idea for publishing this book, did you feel like, okay, I'm happy to make this transition to do this thing instead? Or did you still have that like dream to pursue animation?
I've always been interested in animation because I'm a bit of a ham and an actor. Yeah, I always wanted to go into animation, and but yet I needed to make a living, so I continued to work for the medical school freelance. I
Mm-hmm.
continued to do these books, thinking if the books sell okay, then I could do a book a year, and that way I could survive as a parent at home. I could work from
Mm-hmm.
home, continue the freelance of the medical illustrations that I was doing. And that's what I thought I would do until, and during that time, I met my second husband, who was in dental school at the time, but I had met him first at the television station. He had been working in props, and he was one of these outrageous, outspoken, funny, animated guy with you know, lots of personality. And he was finishing his float plane rating when I met him at the airport. I love to fly. I love little airplanes. And I had gone up to the airport with the baby just to look at little airplanes, just to watch them take off and land, because I love to fly. And I used to think, who could own one of these? Who in the world could fly one of these? And Rod landed and recognized me down in the parking lot where the little airplanes were. And that did it. I loved the fact that he had this magic that he could fly, right? That was his magic. And he was funny. And I met his mom and dad. I loved his mom and dad. And I thought, I want this family. But he said, if you want to be with me, I'm going to go up north because I want to provide a service to the communities up there. I want to own an airplane, but I want to be able to use it as a vehicle so I can provide this service. So he
Mm-hmm.
was planning to into the native communities 1 week out of every month from any Arctic community. And I thought, wow, an adventure, right? So I had this house, and I had this job, but I also had these little books. And I thought I can do those little books from anywhere. And I really loved his mom and dad. So I said, if we can move to Lynn Lake, Manitoba, where your mom and dad are, you got it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I did. I sold the house and off we went to northern Manitoba. And what an adventure that was. I've never lived in a tiny town. I don't know how much time you have, but here's what happens in a tiny town. I was buying groceries for the first day, and the
Mm-hmm.
house was like a block away from the grocery store. And the woman who was at the cash was awful, barking at people and complaining. And are you standing in line? Are you going to gossip with somebody? I don't have all day. Are you going to buy that or not? Move up, move up. And I paid for my groceries. And when I went outside, the young woman who was ahead of me was putting her baby in a pram. And I said, that woman's a bitch. And this lady put the kid away and walked away. Well, by the time I got home, my phone was ringing, and it was Lena from the corner store, the lady that was, that was at the checkout. And she said, I hear you call me a bitch. You be careful. You were talking to my sister-in-law. So I
Oh my
learned
God.
you have to be caring and you have to be kind, and you grow up when you're in a small town, and you do become a nicer person. You have to become a
Mm-hmm.
nicer person. And the people up there are wonderful. I think if there's any single women who don't know where to turn and can't find a mate, go up north, go to Whitehorse, go to Yellowknife, go to, Inuvik, go to some of these small towns where everybody knows everybody, and you will fit
Mm-hmm.
in, and you will find a world of wonderful friendships and
Mm-hmm.
adventures, and you'll find a partner for sure. There's wonderful people up there, and smart, intelligent, well-educated, but they're irreverent and they're cool and they want something different and they
Mm-hmm.
go for it. you know?
Mhm.
So what a life. I remember one time flying home from Winnipeg and we're in our little airplane. We had a little 185 Cessna, and it was so dark because there's no people down below in northern Manitoba. It's all countryside, and so you see nothing but black below you, and you see the stars glittering on the lakes as you fly, and then the
Wow.
northern lights began. So you're suspended over nothing with the northern
Mhm.
lights all around you. And we said as we were suspended in space, isn't this a privilege? Aren't we lucky? And we were going back to this tiny little town of about 1,000 people and no facilities, and
Wow.
we owned the world.
That's amazing. Wow. Just wow. I have no words for that. But I am curious because you said, when you decided to move up to Lynn Lake with Rod and, your son at the time, you were, you loved his parents. Do you think, the relationship that you formed with his parents, do you think that was healing in some sort of way?
Absolutely. Oh, yes. My
Yeah.
mother-in-law was very much a catalyst between my mother and myself, making us closer. She was very objective and optimistic, and she'd been a grade one teacher all her life, so she had
Wow.
dealt with it, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so, yeah, it was a really lovely family. I really loved Rod's family, and they loved me. And that, when you know that you're loved, boy, that makes you feel settled and whole.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I married their son, and I brought my own little boy into the family, and they were wonderful with him. He became part of the family. There was never any sense that he was other. And I was expecting Katie when we moved up there. And the crazy thing was is that just as we were planning to leave for northern Manitoba, I got this 20-year contract from Universal Press Syndicate. So I was
Wow.
doing cartoons and packing boxes and rocking my new baby. Talk about
Oh,
busy. There wasn't a second of my day that I wasn't busy. And so I signed this contract with great trepidation because, I mean, I knew I could do a book a year, but to do 365 cartoons, for a publication that was deadline driven and very, very aggressive, could I do it? And I thought, if I don't give it my best shot, I'm crazy. So I signed the contract and off I went to this tiny little northern town.
wow. And 20 years. That is insane.
Yeah, we were able to change that and make some differences. So now the contract is 7 years, and they should be able to extend it for 3, which would make it 10 years if the strip is in over 150 papers or something like that. That was then, but this is now, and newspapers are changing, and the comic page is dwindling, and people get their cartoons online and they buy graphic novels. I mean, you don't aspire as a cartoonist to be a syndicated cartoonist anymore. At one time, it was the goal, the holy grail was, my God, if you got that piece of real estate in a newspaper, you were in heaven. It was a huge amount of work, but worth every cent and worth every minute because the outcome was, it was wonderful. You'd be excited about seeing your work in the paper. You'd be interested in what the response was. And the relationship with the other people in the industry was amazing. I mean, I got to meet people from MASH and I got to know Phyllis Diller. And, you meet all kinds of comedians and writers and illustrators and people from Disney. And it was a life that it was just endlessly exciting and fun. And I was so lucky. I was so lucky to be able to do that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's wild to think about. And, I think when people are faced with fame, as you were, they tend to change. Do you think you changed when you became,
Yeah.
well
Yeah.
known?
It's not healthy at all. It's not healthy, especially when people are interviewing you a lot.
Mm,
If you're on doing book tours and things like that, you're doing radio and television and magazines and being photographed and being asked your opinion, and people are very deferential, and eventually you start to believe the hype, right? You also
mm-hmm.
want to be that magical, amazing, incredibly funny, always on character that they think you are or want you to be for their interviews and their publicity, right? And part of you becomes arrogant and full of yourself, and part of you becomes terrified because how long can you sustain that? And I can see where people who are really in the public eye, like performers and musicians, will fall into the traps of taking drugs and things like that because you cannot
Mm-hmm.
possibly this miraculous being that everybody wants you to be, and eventually you want to be. Yeah, I have to live up to all of that stuff. And I remember one time standing in a lineup, and I can't remember where it was a bank. And I was so used to being, oh, come on in, and oh, here she is, that I was thinking, why am I in this lineup? Don't they know who I am? And when that entered my head, I thought, okay, I'm there. I'm at that horrible stage where you think you're wonderful. That's got to
Mm-hmm.
go. And then one time I was getting dressed up, with my suitcase, getting ready to go on one of these trips. And my son looked at me as I was leaving and he said, "Are you turning into Lynn Johnston again?" And for me, it was the best thing in the world to live in a small town, because in a small town, everybody knows who you are. You put your garbage out with everybody else. You're fighting over that green pepper, and, your kids getting bawled out at school. I mean, you're right in there with the rest of the community, and you're not special at all. So being in a
Mm-hmm.
small community, away from where I was accessible, people couldn't, and they did, National Film Board and others came up to see us in northern Manitoba, but it was a huge effort. If I was
Mm-hmm.
living in Hamilton, Vancouver, because I wanted to be all things to all people and be this magical being that they want you to be and you want to be, I would have said yes to every speaking engagement and every public service announcement. I would have made such an asshole of myself. I would have, And so that desperate need to be all things to all people will kill you. It literally will kill you. And I'm so glad that I was doing an entertainment form that kept me in a studio by myself, because the
Mm-hmm.
characters were on the stage. Characters were doing the theater.
And listeners, just so you understand, you know, like the reach that you had. For better or for worse, your script was in over 2,000 papers that were spread across 23 countries. And at the peak, 230 million people read your comic. And
Mm.
that is almost like it's hard to wrap your brain around that. How do you feel about that?
You don't feel about it other than you say, I'm still in the game. I'm still doing okay. I'm still out there. It's, it's a very strange job that, all I liken it to getting into a Zodiac and going down the Colorado River. Once you're in that boat, you can't go back. You can't go backwards. You're in the rapids, and all you can do is paddle and stay afloat. So a lot of the time that you're doing this job, you're paddling and staying afloat. So the number of papers or the publicity, it all is secondary to just staying afloat, just making. I call that piece of real estate in the paper real estate for a reason, because it's very, very valuable. And if you're not
Mm,
fulfilling the obligation to keep that thing out there and popular, you're going to lose that piece of real estate, right? Or it gets to the bottom of the page, or it's shrunk down, or it's put in another section. It's all to do with popularity and sales and money and all of that stuff. It's a business. People think, oh, you just do a drawing a day and send it in. Must be easy. But you have to think of that, and they only accept a week at a time. So you have to think of that week, draw the week, ink the week. You have to have editors look at it. It's a tremendous amount of work, and you're working evenings and weekends in hotel rooms and on planes. And I had, in those days we all had checkbooks, right? We didn't have credit cards as much as we have now, and my checkbooks were filled with gags. I'd pull over to the side of the road and think, "Oh my God, if I don't write that down now, I'll forget it." And you
mm-hmm.
do. And so, yeah, you're on record and you're working all the time. when you're doing that job. It's
And,
kind of insane.
and simultaneously, like, you're a wife, you're a mother, you're juggling life as it is. And I think it's, you know, one of the wonderful things about speaking to people who have succeeded to such a high degree in their life is, I very much, and I don't want this to come off the wrong way, but, as a child, I 100% idolized you. And being able to sit down and have a conversation with you, it's like you are just a person like me. And it's like kind of, I suppose, reassuring in a sense that anyone can reach that level of success. Anyone can be impacted from that level of success. And, we all have to go through the mundane things of daily life. That it's I don't know if any of that made sense. My brain is going crazy apparently. But yeah, it's just so interesting to hear like the experience that you had, because it sounds like you were under so much pressure and so much like constant like this this need to be creating and to be growing this world that you had. And it just sounds so overwhelming.
I
Yeah.
loved it. I'm a hard worker. If you're not a real hard worker, this is not the job for you. You have to be a very focused and deadline driven. You have to be a hard worker, and you have to be very critical of yourself, and I had to look at it in terms of uh, my readers. And my mother-in-law actually never got an elephant joke. She was awful when it came to irony and wordplay and stuff like that. She would scratch her head, and even though she was a grade 1 teacher and had this huge experience with kids and words and teaching and all, she never got a joke. So I would take all of my rough to Ruth, and I would have
Yeah.
her read through, and if she would say, "Well, that's nice, dear," and I say, "But did you get it?" "Well, no, but I like the drawing, so if you didn't get it, I could read through it." So, Ruth was my best editor, because I knew that if Ruth didn't get a joke, then 90% of my audience wasn't gonna get a joke either. So I had to be strict with myself and be able to redraw things, rewrite things, even though I thought it was great. If Ruth didn't get it, it wasn't gonna go out there. So you need to
Yeah.
be able to listen to people. It's very hard to take criticism for other people if you're an artsy craftsy and you think you're doing great. "What do you mean you don't understand it, you fool?"
Yeah. It's your
But
problem. Now that we've kind of gotten to you doing For Better or For Worse, tell me about the family, because as a reader of the book and as I've spoken to other readers and heard other people speak about the comic, it really feels like the Patterson family and the extended universe of For Better or For Worse. It feels like the real people. Like it feels like I know them, and it is there's no other word to describe it, but they feel real to me. And how did you create this world? How did you organize it in your head? Where did the ideas come from? I've just asked you like 3 different questions there, but give me, how did it all start? How did you do it?
well, to begin with, it was based on my family,
Mhm.
and, the characters were all sort of based on my family. But people, I mean, days will go by when nothing funny is said and nothing interesting happens, right, in real life. So you're making up a lot of stuff. And it's a storytelling gig as well. It's storytelling, it's making stuff up, and by listening to friends. And I mean, living in a small town is great, because you get to know a lot of people. You're sitting in their kitchen, you're listening to them talk about their kids and their dog and their in-laws and whatever, and you say, "Ooh, that's good, and that's good, and I'll use that," right? And so a lot of it came from other people and stuff that I knew to be true. I wanted it all to be believable. And, because I get bored easily, I couldn't keep everybody the same age. I had to grow them up, because my kids, as they grew up, they got more interesting. They had better vocabulary and had different friends and were, faced with different obstacles. And I wanted to be able to use all of that. And also the challenge of showing characters growing and changing was good for me. I like a challenge. It became kind of a unique life story of a family. And it began with Michael and Elizabeth, very young kids, and it ended with Michael's children about the same age. So it was a full cycle, of
Mhm.
growth, like right back to the beginning again. And once I had gone that route, once all of my characters had grown up, I felt that I had told the story that I needed to tell, and I was ready
Mhm.
to end the story. And about that time, my marriage was ending. So, my pilot dentist went on to other things, and we split up. And his mom and dad had died as well, which changed everything, right? And so people changed, and I moved back to Vancouver from Northern Ontario and started again. But that story is still out there, and it was loosely based on my family. And if what I tried to do when I had the characters grow and change was that I had the characters grow up uh, uh, 3 years after my own kids. So I let my own kids grow up for 3 years, and then I started the characters aging so that there would be a bit of a buffer between my real kids and the characters in the story. And I would often ask Kate and Aaron if I could write a story. There'd be a certain story. Like one time when Aaron was a teenager, he said, "Why do you never write about zits? Because that's a problem for all of us." And I said, "Well, I didn't want to infringe on any of yours. I didn't want to hurt anybody's feelings." And he said, "No, you got to do zit." He said, the other day, he said, I had such a big zit on my nose, I couldn't even go to school. And I thought, wow, I said, "Can I do a story about that?" And he said, "Of course, that's what my life is like." And, there were times when the kids were bullied when they were young because people thought we were really rich or really, famous or something. And people have these stereotype ideas again about who you are and how your life is. And they imagine that you're, you know, I don't know what they imagine.
And yeah, it's just wild. Like when people say that they love the family you created and they love everything that you've done, like how does that make you feel?
Like I told the story well, because if it doesn't feel like your family, then it wasn't realistic. And I was
Mhm.
always getting letters from young moms who were my age, but I got letters from nuns and priests and, all people from all walks of life. And certain stories would trigger letters. And I knew that I would, and this was, of course, before email. So it all
Mm,
came in the
yep.
mail, boxes of mail from time to time. And I would ask friends to help me answer them because I wanted to answer them all. And, uh, and I did. And I had a wonderful relationship with my readers. And some of the readers would complain about something. And if it was a legitimate complaint, I would write back to them and say, "Yeah, that's a legitimate complaint. Thanks for telling me," right? One time I got a letter from a woman who just lambasted me over a strip, just awful. And I looked up the strip and I thought, it's not that bad, right? So I wrote a letter to this woman and I said, "I've just looked up the strip that you hate, and I thought it's not that bad. So I'm thinking you must have had a really bad day, and I hope everything's okay now." That was my letter to her. So I get a
Oh,
letter back from her. Oh my God. She said, "When I threw the letter into the post box, I tried to get it back because I knew it was a horrible letter." And she said, my life was in shambles. I was in a terrible mood. I just lashed out at the first thing that came to mind. She said, "I couldn't get my hand into the letterbox to get it back." So then she said, "I thought, oh, well, an editor will read it. She'll never see it." And she said, "I can't believe you actually read it." And she said, "You're right. I had a terrible day." And we wrote back and forth a couple of times. And it was that kind of relationship. I mean, it didn't matter if there
yeah.
were thousands of people reading, but that one-on-one relationship was lovely. But I've answered every reasonable letter that's ever come my way, and in the end, it makes a difference because you're touching people in a concrete way. It's an actual, solid piece of paper that you receive. And even now, I'll get a note from someone who will send me a photograph. "You sent me this letter 20 years ago," right? I was kind of a lonely kid and never thought I had any friends, right? And now
Mhm.
I feel as though I'm connected with people from Tasmania to, I don't know, Switzerland. It's just, it's been a wonderful, wonderful life that way.
Gosh, I guess I should have. I always threatened to write you a letter, but then I just thought, oh no, she won't answer me. I should have written you a letter. Oh, it's just lovely that you were able to like create those relationships with people. And like you said, some of the letters were not always the most positive. And I suppose that will take me to my next line of questioning, which is the story about Lawrence. So for those of us who aren't familiar, March 26, 1993 was when the strip of Lawrence coming out first ran. And that was 10 years before the legalization of gay marriage in Ontario. And, your editors warned you at the time you were running at about 2,000 papers. Your editors warned you, you might lose about 6 or 7 papers. You ended up losing about 40, and then you gained about 50. So tell me your decision, first of all, to have Lawrence be gay and make this statement that was honestly needed at the time. We've come such a long way in terms of LGBTQ rights and respect. And now in 2025, I don't think the reaction would be the same. But 1993 was a different time. And the fact that people were so against someone in your book, a character that people loved, came out as gay was villainized. So take me through that. Take me through your decision to do that.
Well, by the time that story came around, I had been doing the strip for quite a few years, and the kids had grown from babies to now teenagers. And I was starting to experiment with realistic stories, like real serious stories. And around the time that Michael was maybe 17, 16, in the comics. My friend Michael Vadboncourt, who was a comedian and a performer in Toronto, somebody I had known since grade 8. I don't know, we were in art class together causing trouble, and his best friend, Paul, became a blackout comedy team in Toronto in gay bars for a lot of the gay bars, right? And I would go to these bars and watch the two of them on stage, and they were hilarious. They were wonderful fun. So Michael was also a comedy writer for the CBC, just endlessly funny, wonderful guy. Anyways, I'd known Michael since I was a kid, and he was always exceptional, always who he was, always theatrical and flamboyant and feminine. And, he was like funny and talented. And I kept in touch with the two of them, Paul and Michael, when I was living in Northern Ontario, North Bay. And I would go down and see them from time to time. And then I thought I hadn't heard from them for a while. So I called Michael's apartment and there was no answer. And I called Paul's apartment and I said, "What's going on with Michael?" I called him a few times and he's not there. And he said, "Lynn, Michael was murdered." And he had been killed by a young man who he had met on the street. Guy was asking for money and Michael gave him $40 and said, "There's a shelter over there. For $20 you can stay the night at the shelter. So buy yourself some food and stay in the shelter tonight, and that'll give you one night off the street." So the kid followed him home, took the $40, bought a knife, went back to Michael's place, knocked on the door, and when Michael came to the door, he killed him. And he went in and he took his bicycle and his stereo. He took whatever he can carry on this bicycle. He was just a street kid, right? Well, the attitude of the police at the time was, well, there's another predator off the street. And this poor young boy who was probably, a victim of Michael. And Paul was absolutely, he was beyond grieving and overwhelmed. And I kept thinking, but Michael's not a predator. I mean, he might have had a wacky life that I didn't know a whole lot about, but he was, he was this tiny little person who wouldn't, he wouldn't threaten anyone. And for them to think that he was a predator and was now off the street was horrific. And I remember thinking, I've known him since I was a kid. And people who are different are your neighbors, your family, the people you work with. And I wanted to do a story that would take a family friend that you've known all your life and say something about them that was very real and maybe a little upsetting. So, because Michael had been murdered, I wanted to do this for him. And so, the one character that I thought would be the perfect character was Lawrence, because I had a rough time fitting him in. He was Michael's best pal when the strip began. And I didn't have him living anywhere. He wasn't with anyone. And Ellie's nemesis, Connie, next door, was supposed to be the woman who had it all. She had the job and the attractiveness, and she was going out and partying and having a life of a single, well-off woman. Well, Ellie was struggling at home with kids and was jealous, right? But there's no such thing as somebody all good or somebody all bad or somebody perfect. I mean, and so these characters became very real, and I connected Lawrence with Connie. So she was a single mom of this young boy who was a mix of black and white, and her husband, and I had been working with the medical missions, and I had been in Peru and South America working with the medical missions, and I had met a number of doctors down there who were very handsome black men, and thinking, yes, I can see this young nurse falling in love and having this young boy, and the marriage not working out, and she comes back to Canada with this boy. And so there was the added interest of what happened to the husband, and would Lawrence ever meet his dad, and that type of thing. So because Lawrence was kind of this nebulous character to begin with, but one of my favorite characters, because he was sort of the common sense. If Michael was a helium balloon, Lawrence held the string, kind of thing, right? So so Lawrence admits to Michael, he wants to tell Michael that he is different. And how does he tell his parents? And this was all a really difficult story to tell, but I was very grateful that my brother-in-law was gay, and he came out about that time. And that's, I don't know how much time we have, but I'll quickly tell you, I was looking out the window. We were living in this little Arctic town, looking out the window, and there's Ralph chopping my firewood, like whack, 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 whack. And I opened the door and I said, "What's going on?" And he said, "I am so tired, whack, of my mother introducing me, whack, to nice girls, whack, because I'm not going to marry a woman. Do you understand?" And I said, "Absolutely. Absolutely." So he came in and we talked about it, and we told my husband, and he said, "Well, we've got to tell our folks." So we told his mom, and she said, "Oh my goodness, all these years I've been trying to find a nice girl for my boy, and I should have been looking for a nice boy," right? So she was very accepting. But she said, "Let's not tell Dad because he has a bad heart." And we said, "You can't keep a secret like this." So when we told Tom, and it was one of these sort of family interventions, "Tom, this is something we all have to tell you," he said, "Well, I've known since you were 11. So it was such an accepting family, and Ralph was wonderful in that he helped me write this story from his point of view. So I said, "What
Mm-hmm.
is the one word that comes to mind when you finally came out to everybody?" And he said, "Relief." It was such a
Mm-hmm.
relief to sort of just be who I was, you know. And he's married to a wonderful person, and the two of them have been together for years and years. And you know, that relationship helped me create a character that was based in reality. And when the
Mm-hmm.
story ran, I thought I might get a few phone calls, but it was relentless, because in those days, it was a serious breach. You don't put this in the comics page. You know, like the comics page was designed to bring young readers into the newspaper, because these big newspaper magnates didn't want to see their audience sort of deplete as people got older. They wanted to bring in a whole new young crowd of people that would want to read the paper. And how do you get young people? You do a comic strip that would appeal to a 9-year-old boy, you know? And so I felt that I could do this. And I wanted to do it for my friend Michael. I wanted to do it for my brother-in-law. But I wanted to do it because as an artist, you know, so many of our friends are gay, men and women, and they're theatrical and creative and funny and talented and kind and generous and welcoming. And I know doll makers and musicians and artists and sculptors, and you know, thank God for these people. I love them all. And so it was something for them, for my
Mm-hmm.
friends. You know, we got 3,000 letters, and 70% were positive, but the negative ones were so negative and so biased that you couldn't have a conversation with any of these people. You know, the few that were reasonable, we responded to, but so many of them were hateful. to the point where it was insanely hateful and with no real basis for it, right? We did lose quite a few papers, but for every paper I lost, I sort of got a couple more because, and the interesting thing was that a big paper like the Chicago Tribune would welcome controversy. They love controversy because it's publicity, right? Any publicity is good publicity. But a small paper like the Dundas Valley Journal or the Poughkeepsie Bee or something, you've got an editor who lives in a small town who's in the coffee shop having a coffee, and somebody can come in and say, I hate what you put in the paper this morning. And so they were very vulnerable. And I remember I got so many calls from editors, and they were reasonable, wonderful people. And they were saying, we can't run the strip in our town because my house was spray painted, my dog was, abducted, my kids were bullied at school. I can't run the story. And the story, I think, ran for 4 weeks. So it was 4 weeks of, what have I done? So anyways, but in the end, it was a very good story. And so many letters came in from people who were saying, I haven't spoken to my son for 3 years. I called him this morning, or I could never understand my daughter. And now I do. And, it was wonderful that way, that it opened dialogue all over the place.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's just, it's wild to think the reaction, because it ran for, like you said, from March 26, 1993 until April 24th, 1993. And there's so much reality in this. Like you said, the reason for doing For Better or For Worse was to show the humorous sides, but also to show the reality of life. And this is a reality of life. There's a specific moment in this particular script where, Michael says things will never be the same again. Like, things will never be good. We'll always know each other, but it won't be the same. And Lawrence kind of looks at him, and then Michael just kind of slugs him on the shoulder. And it's like, it's that recognition for people that regardless of the differences between us, we can still accept each other as human, and we can still accept each other as the people that we were. Like, this does not have to paint us into an image. And honestly, the fact that you got 70% positive responses back in 1993, when the world was a different time, makes me feel so positive about it. Like, yes, you had terrible experiences, people said terrible things to you, but the fact that there was so much positivity and stories of impact makes it well worth it. So it's an interesting story. And did you run it again?
Yes, when it ran for a second time, we kind of braced ourselves for another onslaught of cranky letters and noise, but nothing. So thank you, world. We've made a few progressive changes.
Isn't that amazing? So clearly the world has settled down in that regard. Listeners, we have about 15 minutes left in our conversation today. Perhaps we will have to schedule another one because I've enjoyed it so much. But I suppose the last thing that I would like to talk about is, first of all, you are a very highly awarded woman. I have printed off your list of awards here that were popped on Wikipedia. But I'm really curious about how you feel about these awards, because on your website, these awards are not listed. How do you feel about them? Do you feel like they're a success of yours? Do you think it's the best thing you've ever done? What do you think?
Each award is a real honor because people, the word committee gives me hives because committees are difficult things. If you've ever been on a committee, you might come out saying, I need a drink, right? So when people decide that they would like to honor you with an award, it really is an honor. And I have quite a few, and they've been given to me from everything from First Nations to LGBTQ people, academics. I've got a number of honorary degrees. I mean, and every time it is just such a validation of your work, and it's such a kindness. And I don't take it for granted. And I think the Order of Canada is one that I really treasure, and of course the Reuben Awards, which is the Oscar of the industry, which I treasure. But what was interesting about the Order of Canada is that the Canadian Parliament buildings are quite small. They're when you think about the hundreds of people that are in some of these ballrooms and meeting places, the rooms are beautiful. They're opulent, but they're not that big. So you're not allowed to bring more than one guest when you get the Order of Canada. And so your guest goes into another room and they line you up back and forth like a snake that goes back and forth in alphabetical order before you file into the room where you receive the award. And what was amazing was all these people there, amazing people, and they're all saying, I don't know why I'm here. Do you know why you're here? Really? Well, and some people would say, I don't know why I'm here. And these people were so modest, and they were, inventors and people who've saved lives and medical, miracle people and, just athletes and people who'd accomplished so much. And I'm saying, yeah, I don't know why I'm here. Just draw pictures. It was an experience to see how humble and how gracious these people all were.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, it's such a nice reminder that that is the case, It's like you make it to a certain point in your life, and I think people who are not there yet assume that those people have it all figured out. They know how they got there. They know, they feel deserving of those things, and it's really, I suppose it's like just another dose of reality in the fact that this is the first time everyone's lived this life. It's the first time you've been here as this spirit, as this being. And, having humility in those situations is what keeps you human, is what keeps you centered. It keeps you grounded, I suppose. And I suppose we'll talk about the Reuben Award quickly, because you were the first woman to receive this award, which is an incredible honor. How does that feel to be a woman and given that award?
Well, strangely, in this business, it is such a unique business that the competition is not necessarily between men and women as much as it is between skilled artists. And
Mm-hmm.
so I found the much older people, mostly men, were a little misogynistic and were not that welcoming. But the people who were my age were 100%. I mean, we're all equal. And if you're doing the work, you're getting the kudos. You belong in the club. And so I was given the award by my peers, which was huge at the time. And I didn't feel ready for it. The other nominees, I think Jim Davis, who did Garfield, had been in the business longer, and I thought he would get it. And I met Charles Schultz for the first time. This was in Washington, and leaned over and said, I voted for you. So I thought, wow. Anyways, when I won, I didn't even get up. People were saying, stand up, stand up. But it shouldn't be me. It shouldn't be me. I felt that I had won it too soon in my career, but it was a wonderful honor. I mean, I was numb for that day.
You totally would be, especially when you're surrounded by people who, in your eyes, had accomplished so much. And, you're at the beginning of your career. At that point, I suppose the comic strip would have been out for about 6 years when you won it, which is a huge accomplishment. But I suppose my final question for today, I feel like there's so much more we could have talked about specifically with the comic. We haven't even talked about Farley or, April or any of those things, but I still think we had you share so much, and I'm really appreciative of that. But I suppose my final question is, you finished the comic with the wedding of Elizabeth and Anthony, and they are in the hospital room of Jim, and Iris is there, and the very final line is nothing other than for better or for worse. What does that phrase mean to you, and why did you choose it to be the title of your comic?
I think I was hired by the syndicate to do a comic strip from a woman's point of view, which would counter Blondie and High and Lois and Family Circus and all these strips that were done by men, and it was very optimistic when it came to family. And the goings on were simple things like the dog chewing up a pillow, but I was in the trenches. So they wanted something that, they want to be able to smell those diapers, So, yeah, I was hired to do something that would hit home. From a woman's point of view, and it was my editor, Lee Salem, who suggested the name For Better or For Worse. I didn't like it. I thought it was too long. And we discussed or for better or worse. So they thought or for would go in there. It was a huge title. But in the end, that's what it was about. It was for better or for worse. That's our life. That's all of us. We're all in this life for better or for worse. Let's hope
That
it's for
is true.
better.
Let's hope it's for better. Well, thank you so much, Lynn. I have had such a pleasure speaking to you today. Like I said, I'm now thinking we didn't even speak about Ned. How could we not speak about Ned? And the fact that you were, there's so many things. Oh, goodness. But yes, thank you for your time today. And
You're welcome.
yeah, thank you so much.
Safe
All
travels
right,
back to Canada.
Hi, Mom. Let's see.